Okay, hello, good afternoon. If you are joining us from the United States, my name is Ieva Jusionyte. I am an associate professor at Brown University at the Watson Institute for International and Public Affairs, which is hosting the event. Thank you, Ellen and Alex, for setting this up. I am also, and this is the reason I'm speaking to you, the editor of the California series in Public Anthropology, a book series that focuses on publishing scholarship that tries to reframe public debates and our received understanding of the world with new insights that can lead to imaginative solutions to humanity's most pressing problems. Not a small task, right? I'm joined today, although you cannot see her at the moment, by Kate Marshall, who is the senior editor at the University of California Press for Anthropology and who manages the series. So it is our pleasure to welcome you all to what is now the third New Books in Public Anthropology Virtual Café. We held our first virtual cafe in the fall of 2020 during the pandemic. And we decided to continue with this format because, for one, it allows us to bring together authors who have very full schedules, and it would be very difficult to get them all together in one place at the same time. And on the other hand, because this allows us to have this conversation in front of a global audience. So today, we will hear from the authors of 3 books published over the past year in the California series of Public Anthropology. I know that as an editor of the series, I am not allowed to have favorites, but these 3 books, and I have them all here, well, they are particularly dear to me. And I fell for them as soon as I read the early manuscripts. The authors shared they were meticulously researched, yes, but they were also beautifully written, and they were brave and bold and daring, and the stories and the arguments that they made, they stayed with me long after I closed them. So now that I reread them together in preparation for this event, I'm also struck by the thematic threads that connect them or run through them, such as environmental toxicity and the meaning of community in Rio's and Nikki's books, the struggle for justice and forms of activism in Nikki's and Victoria's books, and the commitment of all 3 to public anthropology. So you are all in for a treat. And without further ado, I will briefly introduce the authors in the order in which they will be talking about the books. Dr. Nicole Fabricant is professor of anthropology at Towson University in Maryland. She's the co-founding member of the South Baltimore Community Land Trust and the author of this great book, Fighting to Breathe, Race, Toxicity, and the Rise of Youth Activism in Baltimore. Rio Morimoto is assistant professor of anthropology at Princeton University, where he facilitates an undergraduate-led research project, Nuclear Princeton, which highlights the under-acknowledged impacts of Princeton's nuclear science and engineering on native lands, communities, and beyond. Rio is the author of Nuclear Ghost, Atomic Livelihoods in Fukushima's Gray Zone. And Dr. Victoria Sanford is professor of anthropology and founding director of the Center for Human Rights and Peace Studies at City University of New York. She served as an expert in the Spanish National Court's genocide case against the Guatemalan generals, including some other trials held in Guatemala, I think. And she's the author of this book, The Murder of Claudina, Isabel, Velasquez, and Her Father's Quest for Justice. So each author will talk about their books for about 10 minutes. And after the presentations, we'll have time for a short conversation. If you have questions, please put them in the Q&A and we'll get to them. Also, if you have not yet purchased these books, or if you already have them but would like to get more for your friends and colleagues and everyone you meet on the street, you can use a promo code UCPSAVE30 to get a 30% discount if you buy them from the University of California Press website. I will put this in the chat. And now I cede the floor to the authors, starting with Nikki.
Thanks so much, Ieva. It's great to be in this conversation, a much needed conversation, I think, in anthropology. So my book, Fighting to Breathe, was a culmination of 10 years of organizing for environmental justice in Baltimore. I was a part of the movement and influenced and shaped much that was written in the book. The book focuses on high school students who, along with teachers and allies, chose to fight against some of the institutions, the industries that were responsible for overburdening their community. So for more than a decade, I was working along the students in a much longer term participatory action research project to systematically look at some of the inequities in land use and waste management. Two intersecting systems that have exacerbated forms of uneven development in a city like Baltimore. And the goals of the students weren't just to understand these systems, but to actually envision, to design, and to begin to map out alternative modes of development that would improve the lives of poor Brown and Black folks. So the book is really told from the perspective of the young activists, trying to sketch in a kind of much more ethnographic sense, all the aspects of their lives, the kinds of interlocking systems of oppression that impacted and led to this youth movement. So the first step of the process was working alongside residents to develop a sort of decentered historical perspective. And I told the narrative in a very linear way, sort of from beginning to end as the campaigns evolved. And chapter 1 describes students' reaction to a lethal chemical spill. So I remember being in the high school when chlorosulfuric acid was leaked out of a tanker and we were all on lockdown because it was a lethal. When this chemical mixed with the air, it became quite lethal. And so that began their interest in sort of tracing a history of uneven or unfair development from the periphery where they were living back to the sort of core of the city. I argue that environmental toxicity in South Baltimore is a form of state-sanctioned violence that's not accidental, but embedded in historically established systems. And so the first chapter, really through the narrative and the lens of the students as they were unpacking these systems, really went all the way back to guano trade in the 1800s in the Baltimore Peninsula, to the industrial expansion throughout the 20th century. The peninsula became a space for unregulated industry alongside homes for relocated Black and white immigrants. And then obviously non-renewable fossil fuels like coal and big oil came to be housed on the periphery in the 20th century. And the area has much more recently become a wasteland, this whole South Baltimore Peninsula, for housing medical waste incinerators, our large trash to energy incinerator, and a landfill. So this is sort of the beginning of the book, but the rest of the book really does track from this historical perspective of unfair development to looking at the ways in which the youth began organizing for change. So chapter 2 really does sketch an important campaign that I was a part of. It's filled with storytelling and testimonials in these chapters where students recount some of the difficult lives that they've led and their families have endured, some of the health problems. This area has some of the highest rates of respiratory illnesses as a result of cumulative impacts of industries. And so through this chapter, we are really introduced to students beyond them as learners and thinkers and they're mapping out a plan to take on a proposal for the nation's largest trash to energy incinerator. It was a proposal that was going to be built about a mile from their school. And I look at kind of art and narrative and the ways in which rap and kind of hip hop has become part of their organizing strategy. And how they built this really incredible dream team filled with experts, from public health experts to environmental justice lawyers. And the remaining chapters really do detail some of the successes, but also the struggles, the ongoing struggles of this kind of organizing to take on more polluting industries in an already overburdened area. And so out of the Trash to Energy, or Energy Answers campaign, as it's called, the youth began really thinking about land uses in the community and how to control land. Because essentially decisions are being made about the uses of land without their input. And so as the narrative moves chronologically, I begin to map out the remaining chapters, are really the ways in which the youth are envisioning fair development. And so part of fair development or community-led development has to do with questions around land use instead of waste infrastructure, thinking about long-term affordable housing. And this was something that became a kind of citywide campaign to build out land trusts as a participatory and democratic structure that not only preserves the land, but also provides opportunities for folks in the area to have long-term and affordable housing. And as the book, moves through, it also begins to envision regenerative economies. And so zero waste was very much a part of the vision. So if most of the food waste is being burned or buried in their communities, what alternatives exist? So really studying systematically regenerative economics, visiting some Bay Area. And that's the last chapter, is kind of mapping out their vision essentially for a zero waste future. So at the end of the book, I reflect upon being an activist involved in a youth movement, right? And my role. I pose several questions that I think for folks studying movements or thinking about movements, these are essential in terms of how we write about, how we think about, and how we co-produce knowledge. And so one area that I've been thinking a lot about is, what can critical solidarity look like instead of one-off projects that turn students into either researchers or community engaged representatives of a university? What does kind of solidarity look like over longer periods of time? How can we construct collective projects that defy sort of the individualism of the academy is something that I'm constantly struggling with. So what are the collective structures of knowledge production? How can we hold also our institutions accountable when we write for the general public? What does it mean to kind of reclaim public spaces, particularly public universities, right? So those are some of the questions. At the very end, in the nature of Laura Pulido, who's a geographer and done a lot of activist work, kind of think about 3 areas of intervention, and I'll sort of end with those. These are sort of lessons or things I take away. And I'm happy to speak more about these as we engage in dialogue. But I think one is that working alongside the youth and thinking about innovating alternatives has provoked for me, what's the role of a teacher, right? Like not teaching necessarily for the sake of teaching or writing for the academy, but thinking about how our teaching can advance certain political and social change agendas. What does that look like? And then how do we model, I think, in our relationships with students, these longer term and meaningful relationships, not in a kind of extractive or an exchange value, but what does it look like to sort of be aligned with movements and writing about it? And then maybe turning the lens of inquiry is something I've thought more and more, because at the very end of the book, the youth have asked me to begin to organize on my campus and think about waste flows. And so really interrogating, I think, the institutions that we're a part of, the laboring hierarchies that might exist, where waste is burned and buried, where it travels, right, in a kind of commodity chain analysis sort of way. And then the impacts. I think in anthropology, we're sort of always looking out there, right, for the answers, but actually there are systematic ways in which we could be studying our own institutions and really pressuring them to begin to think about alternative, forms of knowledge production and education. So I'll end there with some of those questions.
Thank you, Nikki. Rio, you're next.
I'm very honored to be here. Thank you, Ieva and Kate, and also the Watson Institute for hosting this. When I heard that I have 10 minutes, I didn't know what to do. So I just looked at my book and then just decided to read off of the excerpt of the epilogue, which I described the loss of one of my main interlocutors, who basically told me about the nuclear ghost, which led me to explore this particular area that I wrote in the book. So I'll just read it. Hatsumi died in 2018. I received the sad news in Princeton. I had last seen her 6 months previously. My last brief sight of Hatsumi, with her awkwardly positioned white knit hat, conjured a memory of her yelling at the foreign film director and me to leave her property on my first visit in July 2013. On that last day with her, there was no hint of the film-worthy fierceness the film director had found in Hatsumi. Hatsumi acted as cheerful as ever, joking about how much older I looked. I was doubtful when I first met you, but maybe now you could teach something. Hatsumi teased me in her usual manner. I knew Hatsumi for only 5 years. Even in that brief window of time, nearly 1/6 of the time it would take for cesium-137 to decay in half, she proved that centering my analysis of the nuclear accident on radiation and its bodily harm could only touch, at most, half of how she lived and died in Minamisoma. Before we said goodbye, Hatsumi mentioned how the Minamisoma people helped me get the job at Princeton, so I was forever in their debt. I told her how she was right about that, and she said I was a loyal servant of N. Think about it. Isn't it weird that we met? There must be some supernatural codes, don't you think? She mused. Trying to be witty, I almost mentioned that the nuclear ghost was the missing link, but I swallowed my words. Although Hatsumi never told me what the nuclear ghost was, I had met many residents in Fukushima's gray zone who forever changed my perspective on the nuclear accident, coastal Fukushima, and the environmental disaster. In a city where radiation's real and imagined presence haphazardly divided its geography, ecology, people, and community, my search for the nuclear ghost shape-shifted to the act of interlacing the invisible and unexpected, though meaningful connection, or what they call N, with strangers I met in the region. Why was I attracted to a specific group of people over others in my fieldwork? I easily could have featured people who had dedicated their time and efforts to challenging the state and the electric company, or I could have focused on those who decided not to come back to coastal Fukushima because they thought it was unsafe to live there. I often met audiences, academic or otherwise, who seems to expect to hear those stories in my ethnography, but my N guided me to tell other stories. My ethnography of the fallout started in 2013 as a reaction against the foreign filmmaker who attempted to document the exposed population in coastal Fukushima. Standing outside the blind spots of his filmographic gaze and acting as a mere translator, I felt the urge to capture what was left unrecorded by his camera lens. Collaborating with residents, I wanted my ethnography to co-produce a new intersubjective narrative out of what could be told that might exist in the gray zone between what was already told and what was untold of the nuclear accident. Richard Parmentier says that for anthropology, truth is the premise rather than the conclusion of discourse. My ethnography indicates one messy truth about the residents who lived through the first decade of the nuclear accident. Though the accident and its aftermath coercively put the region and its residents in a less than ideal state, those facts could not annihilate their desires and efforts to make their homes and land fertile and meaningful for those who might come after them. In my last conversation with Hatsumi, she did not say anything about her health, and she did not attribute it to the accident. Only a year later, in 2019, when I visited to properly mourn Hatsumi's death, did I learn from one of her daughters that cancer had taken Hatsumi's life. The same daughter told me about Hatsumi's survival of a previously diagnosed case of cancer, which she had not disclosed even to her daughters. She was a strong lady, said the daughter after informing about Hatsumi in tears, and a wise one, I added after offering an incense stick to the family altar with her cremated remains. Learning about her earlier cancer survival gave me a new perspective on Hatsumi. She had intimately known what it meant to be exposed to radiation, though of a very different kind from her past medical treatment. I wondered if her medical history had any bearing on her view of the nuclear ghost of Minamisoma. Hatsumi is no longer here to answer this question or crack a joke. All I have now are the words she left with me. Tell the world, and especially younger generations, what you witnessed in Minamisoma. I hope I have lived up to her expectations with this book. When I saw Hatsumi's cremated remains, I remembered the question I had failed to ask her during our final meeting a year before. I wanted to know whether she had led a good life in Minamisoma. Like many other elderly residents in the region, Hatsumi had often talked about wanting to die well. During my time there, I spent a significant amount of time hanging out with elders as their presence in the city became more pronounced after the accident. I witnessed them suffering and getting angry, sad, and at times depressed. Still, those experiences failed to define who these people were or what it meant for them to try to live and die well in Fukushima's gray zone. For Hatsumi, dying well meant not burdening those who would remain after she departed this world. Remembering her wish has helped me to understand why she did not want to inform me about her health struggles or attribute them to the nuclear accident. In their idiosyncratic ways, many residents have confronted death's haunting and universal fate by taking on the moral responsibility of leaving fewer burdens to the generation to follow them. As Haruki Murakami puts it, death is not the opposite of life, but an innate part of it. By living our lives, we nurture death. They did not want to die as a nuclear ghost or to make others become one after their death. In the grand Buddhist theory of the transmigration of the soul, N is as much about interweaving people, things, land, and non-human others in a knot of fate as it is about untangling the same knot so that when people depart to the other world, they can be reincarnated to something new. Perhaps detachment is a pressing concern among elderly residents, for whom death feels more present than the cumulative biological effects of radiation. For them, the moral reckoning of detachment depends on their commitment to intergenerational succession, creating a good life for others. The residents I interacted with voiced their regrets about leaving behind the crippled nuclear power plant, a disintegrated community, and the irradiated soil and environment. What their atomic livelihoods suggest is that the fundamental issue of nuclear energy that we need to be attuned to is not limited to the risk of the accident, low dose radiation exposure, or the long durée of nuclear waste, which means that technoscientific progress alone cannot address it. Instead, nuclear energy is an unsustainable structural threat. Its intergenerational life cycle collides with the humble individual and collective atomic livelihoods that work towards making life and land better for those who might follow. Unfortunately, the desire that the elders like Hatsumi had to create better life for future generations might not be actualized anytime soon. While I have no magic solution for undoing Japan's nuclear legacy, I want to suggest something to you, the readers of this book. The age of decommissioning requires all of us to learn to respect a land that embodies the cycle of existence in which the intergenerational hopes, desires, and the struggles of residents and ancestors like Hatsumi keep dwelling. This is the message I received from the nuclear ghost of Minamisoma 9 years after my first encounter with it in 2013. I wish I could tell Hatsumi about my current interpretation. Knowing her, I bet she would have said to me jokingly that I was wrong and I needed to stay in Minamisoma longer. Thank you.
Thank you, Rio. Victoria?
Thank you. It's both so interesting. The books are so interesting, and I really enjoyed both of your presentations about your books as well. And I also want to thank Ieva and Kate and UC Press and the Watson Institute for bringing us together and for just so consistently producing such amazing books that I think really make a big contribution to public anthropology. I am a public anthropologist, so I'm going to kind of talk about how I came to write this book, and because I think it kind of speaks to the way we do our anthropology. It was really interesting for me listening to Nicole and Rio as well, because they kind of express the same thing. It's like we start our projects because we believe in working in the communities where we do our work, but our work is also defined by those communities. So sometimes it feels like the work is kind of serendipitous, right? You don't actually end up doing what you started out to do, but it ends up being so much richer because it kind of took you on a different path. And that's how I ended up doing this book. It wasn't my intention to do research about feminicide or the killing of women in Guatemala City. It wasn't my intention at all when I started this project. In 2005, I was in Guatemala. I was actually had plans to finish a book on Colombia that I still haven't finished. And I was invited to the home of Amilcar Mendez, who's a human rights leader in Guatemala. And I knew him from work I had previously done. I started working in Guatemala in 1990 and with the Guatemalan Forensic Anthropology Foundation in 1994. And in 1994, we were doing exhumations of clandestine cemeteries of Maya massacre victims killed by the army during the genocide. And that 1994 is before the peace accords were signed and before the UN was there or anything. So in any case, I'd been involved in this work documenting the genocide in Guatemala, and I just assumed, because I'd previously worked with Amilcar in some indigenous villages in Quiché, that it was someone from his department of Quiché, an indigenous person who needed assistance. So what kind of assistance did I usually give? I'm a gringa. I would go with them. I'm an anthropologist. You do participant observation. So I would accompany them, but my presence would help them get access to a legal system that wasn't really willing to listen to them. And usually my Spanish was better than theirs. Sometimes it wasn't. Sometimes I was trying to explain to them with my very rudimentary understanding of a little bit of indigenous languages like Quiché, what was going on. But it was really my presence as an outsider accompanying them would perhaps give some attention to their case. So I went over to Amilcar's house expecting to find an indigenous person who traveled from some isolated rural village, and I met Claudina Isabel's father. And Claudina Isabel's father is taller than me, and he's whiter than me, and he's an upper middle class urban auditor in Guatemala City, and he's conservative and evangelical. And I thought, what is this about? And then I found out that his daughter had been murdered that she had been a classmate of a milker's daughter at the law school in Guatemala City, and that he wasn't getting any traction at all trying to get the case investigated. And, you know, in the process of working with him, I had assumed, well, I'll go as a favor to a milkar, but, you know, it's going to last 15 minutes because I assumed he would try to evangelize me, which he didn't. And so I kept going with him. So we went to the police and we went to the prosecutor's office and we went to the morgue and we went to international agencies and we went to embassies and we went to NGOs. And in the process, what we ended up doing, because he's an auditor and I'm a participant observer as an anthropologist, is we did an audit of the legal system in Guatemala, what happens to women when they're killed, and what's the process. And in order to document that, what we realized was we needed to know what's supposed to happen, right? So what are the laws in Guatemala? What's supposed to happen from the crime scene when a body is found to going to the morgue, to the police investigators, to the prosecutors, to the courts? What are the procedures that are supposed to happen? Then we had to match those up to international standards and protocols. Do they match up with these? So we started involving different investigators and forensic experts from the UK and from the US, particularly a Florida team, and trying to understand what was happening, what should be happening, and what might happen to bring justice to this case. And in the process, became involved in some other cases in Guatemala as well. And ultimately, that's what the book is about. It's about the different places where the system fails women and how it does it on a personal story level and the individual stories of the women in this book, but also systematically what structurally doesn't work. How do you explain a 98% impunity rate for the killing of women in Guatemala? How do you explain that more than 50% of the cases that are filed are never even opened in the prosecutor's office? So what's behind that? And one of the things that we know when we look at Guatemala today and when we look at Guatemalan immigrants coming in is that gender violence and corruption are big drivers of migration. So if we take that as an understanding, we have to think, well, what's the link between gender violence and migration? And so that's also what part of the book is about, is how do we understand gender violence and migration, but what about the corruption that doesn't let the system work? Why is it that the public health facilities fail women who go there with clear signs of being victims of gender violence and no claims are made, there no rape kits are done, the police aren't notified, the prosecutors aren't notified, and that woman receives no support at all? Why is it that when women present themselves at the police department, they go into a police facility, there at least 30% of them have reported being harassed or sexually assaulted by the police when they go in to report a crime? So there is a good reason why a lot of women don't go, yet still some women go because they're so desperate. They're seeking justice. They're trying to find a path out of the condition in which they're living. Ultimately, if the police actually do collect any data, a prosecutor needs to step in and move the case forward. Well, why don't the prosecutors do that? And one of the reasons is because there's huge corruption in Guatemala, and there's corruption because there's impunity, and the impunity dates back to the genocide of the 1980s and all of the different organized crime and drug trafficking networks that have kind of morphed out of that. So my book is about all of these different things through the stories of different women. And the story of Claudina Isabel and her father's struggle for justice is really the arc that takes us through each of these places. And along the way, I share the stories of women who have sought political asylum in the United States, fleeing different forms of gender violence in different parts of Guatemala. They're from different regions of Guatemala with somewhat different experiences, but the common theme is the corruption when they tried to get assistance within Guatemala for the violence that they were suffering, and then having come here. Now, I want to also say that because of the timing of me writing this book, each of these women were granted political asylum before Trump became president. If he had been president at the time that they presented themselves at the US border, they would have had their babies stripped from their bodies and they would have been separated from them. And it's a completely different story of what would have happened. And so that's also part of the story of the book as well, is how people are treated when they come into this country. And then lastly, because I want to keep to my time, I followed this case through Guatemala. There has never been resolution in Guatemala. When I most recently spoke with Jorge, he told me that they're still trying to get the case moving again, back on a primary suspect we had over 10 years ago. But we don't know what's going to happen given the current status of the justice system in Guatemala. He did take it to the Inter-American Court, and he, quote unquote, won in the Inter-American Court. But at the end of the day, even if you get a symbolic reparation, there's an alert system in Guatemala that's named after his daughter. It's called the Isabel Claudina alert, and it warns people when a girl or a woman has gone missing. There were also some financial reparations for the costs that had been associated with the case, which were actually a lot less, I think, than what the case actually cost. And there were some recommendations made about what the Guatemalan state needed to do specifically for Claudina Isabel's case, as well as for the processing of murder cases of women in Guatemala for feminicide cases, most of which have not been done. The reforms haven't taken place. So that's part of the story as well, is how we move forward. But I think at the end of the day, what really drew me to this case and working with Jorge for more than a decade, even though it was something I had no intention of doing originally, is that there's something that's deeply inspiring, I think, about seeing these kind of David and Goliath cases where you have a man who's a father. He's not a politician. He's not a political activist. He's not an advocate of anything. He's a father who wants justice for the murder of his daughter. And actually, you can see that in the arc of his life, seeking justice for his daughter, he did make changes happen in the system of Guatemala to strengthen the laws to further protect Guatemalan women. And I think that in and of itself is an inspiring story. So thank you.
Thank you, Victoria. And as I was listening to you and kind of also looking at the book covers, all three of these books, they're dealing with really heavy subject matter, feminicide and impunity and radiation and industrial pollution, and how various systems and states and industries are failing people and communities. And you have spent many years both under these conditions while you were kind of living alongside the people who became protagonists of your books. And then you spent many more years thinking about it, looking at your notes, listening to the recordings and putting word after word and typing sentence after sentence. So to write these books, these have been long and I imagine at times grueling journeys. So maybe you can speak a little bit to what was the most challenging or complicated part of the research or writing that went into these books, and also what kept you going. Just looking at, as I mentioned, the covers, there is terror and toxicity and nuclear, but at the same time, there is livelihoods, and then there is fighting and breathing eventually. And then there is quest and justice. So there seems to be this really darkness, but some kind of power of hope there. Yeah, I don't know who would like to tackle this first. Nikki, maybe you.
Sure, we can keep the same structure. So I guess I wrote this book during COVID and the lockdown period. So that was challenging, just getting up at like 4 a.m. and thinking about churning, right? As I had kids home during that period of lockdown. But I would say I was so deeply embedded in the organizing work that what was very hard was like stepping back from it all, because it is my home, right? Baltimore is also my home. It's where I teach. It's where I have constant, sort of long-term relationships and also work going on. So how to not be like pulled in constantly, right? As I was writing, but also separate myself, I think, enough from the stories that I was able to have a lens of kind of critique. And I would say like, I think COVID was just a particularly challenging time, but in our organizing work, what also wound up happening during this period is that the larger organization, the Worker Justice Center, was fraught with all sorts of everyday, just, struggles. I would say like the same race, class, gendered inequities plague our social justice spaces. And so there was a process of accountability during COVID and the writing that I led the charge. And I would say having to be involved in holding folks accountable for the ways in which they were treating organizers, using people's stories, in some respects, I think I thought a lot and wrote a lot about kind of left spaces of justice, like what justice is, to think a little bit alongside Victoria, especially is this the world we want to kind of reproduce, right? And so we had a very long accountability, and it wound up that our group split from this organization. So all that happened during COVID as I was writing this book. And I think that just being sucked in and part of the tension, the friction of everyday organizing, you can't escape or hide from it, right? So I wish there was a retreat to the ivory tower, but I would say as a public intellectual and someone who's deeply a part of, the movement work, when your comrades are deeply in pain and hurt by what's going on in the larger organization, we had to take up both legal and also restorative practices and split.
So I guess the same, I wrote this during the COVID stuff. And one of the things I realized is that, we experience firsthand that the world is very much dividing, whether you take the position of the state or use the science or, believe in something else. And in the moment of divisions and disintegrations, it really made me think about, the people who I worked with, who basically, even before COVID, struggled with the same type of things that the globe was experiencing. And I, at the same time, I also was aware that as the, academic person writing about something, I might unintentionally contribute to, furthering the divisions that already exist. So, when I was writing, I was really thinking well, what are other interventions that exist, that I don't necessarily contribute to creating the divisions? And then that really got me to think about, how these people have been actually living through these divisions and then still finding some hope inside it. And I think the embedded question here for me was I really asked the question about what the public is really, because sometimes my audience, if I write about something anti-nuclear, I know it will sell better, but I have to sort of resist the sort of easy way out of just telling the story being expected in the public, to think about different kind of public that I want to see as a result of it. So that might be something that I would add here.
So for me, because I did start working on this book so very long ago, Claudina Isabel was murdered in August of 2005, and I started accompanying her father in 2006. So it's been a long process working on this. It took 10 years for the case to get to the Inter-American Court in 2015. And in those years, and then still now, Jorge and his family are still seeking justice. We're still trying to get the police to do their job and provide sufficient evidence to a prosecutor. It's moved through lots of offices. I think when you work with people over the long term, you develop relationships with them. And it's really clear that both of my colleagues, Nikki and Rayo, both have relationships with people. And when people die, you experience that loss as well. because they're not just your like informants, they're your friends at the end of the day, because they're people who trust you, who you trust them to share something with you that's real, and they trust you to share that story to a larger public. I think in my case, what has made it the most difficult to write this book or anything else about Guatemala, in fact, I think it was Cynthia Arnson who once said to me, Guatemala is just like a slow moving train wreck that just keeps getting faster. And politically, that is kind of what it's like, because what's taken place over the last 5 years at a really accelerated pace is the criminalization of justice operators and journalists. You know, when I published the book in May of this year, in my book, it said there were 28 justice operators who were forced into exiles. What is a justice operator? Attorney general, judge, prosecutor. These were people who had done really high level, high impact corruption cases when there was a UN commission there. But the UN commission got driven out. And now today, as we are all gathered here, there are more than 100 criminal justice operators and journalists who are out of the country. They've been forced into exile. And one of the lawyers, a prominent lawyer representing them, Claudia Gonzalez, is a political prisoner in Guatemala today, as is Virginia La Parda. These are two women who were lawyers who were representing their clients, and they've basically been jailed for representing prosecutors who were doing their jobs to prosecute corruption. And Jose Ruben Zamora was the founding editor and publisher of El Periódico. That was a paper that came out at the time of the peace accords, and it was very critical of corruption in Guatemala. He's in jail today, and his paper has been closed down. And so, I mean, I think in this ebb and flow, when you do social justice over the long term, it's not just, is it a dark topic? If you're working on social justice issues, it means that you see something that's not fair, something that's unjust, and you've decided to do something about it, whether it's for a day, for a week, for a year, or maybe your life, however long you're going to do it, but you see something that needs to be done because you believe in the possibility of a resolution. And I think that Guatemala, always surprising, in August, they elected a little tiny party that hardly anyone knew. So few people were paying attention to it that the right wing and the corrupt government did not eliminate their possibility to run for office because they saw them as irrelevant. But what they were was an honest party running on a platform of anti-corruption, and they came in second place. And in the runoff, they won. So now you have this anti-corruption party that's been elected, and people are saying, well, where did those people come from? Who voted for them? I know who voted for them, the 70% of people who wanted the UN Commission Against Impunity to stay in Guatemala, but the president drove it out. So, I mean, I think one of the things that's interesting is that we can feel really kind of depressed or disheartened or disillusioned when bad people win. But if you watch over the arc of history, as Martin Luther King so eloquently said, you know, it bends toward justice. It might bend slowly, but it bends toward justice. And I think we saw that in the recent celebrations commemorating the Pinochet, the end of the Pinochet regime, that it was 50 years since the overthrow of Allende. There were massive demonstrations remembering what had happened during that regime in Chile, and thousands of people were out in the streets chanting Nunca Más, never again. So I think we have to keep hope up and look to people who've lived in these conditions and situations and listen to how they want their stories portrayed. And you know, if we're lucky and hit the blue note, it works. So yeah, that would be my thought. Thanks.
That actually leads me to the next question. You already, all of you kind of mentioned what it means for you to do public anthropology, and the series is really, it looks at scholars as public intellectuals, which comes with a kind of responsibility. That is that you know, the way you were talking today, you clearly demonstrate that you care about what you write in ways that exceed making theoretical arguments, as important as those are as well. And you try to open the dialogue with communities and with audiences, but that also entails thinking of what is like what you mentioned, like who is my public, right? So I'm really interested in hearing more about what it means for you to do public anthropology, or to approach what you have been studying through public-facing scholarship. And in particular for you, Victoria, and you, Nikki, these are not your first books. And I wonder how you see them in comparison to your earlier academic work. What was it like to write these books aimed at readers outside of academia? And for you, Rio, this is your first monograph. This is the book that sprouted out from your dissertation, and it is the book that will make your tenure case. But the way you wrote it and the way you directly address the reader in some places, like sharing hope that the book, I quote, may change your past, present, and future, which is not the type of writing that a lot of scholars do. So who is it for then? Like, how were you thinking about that? Maybe all three of you could say how, like, reflect on why you do it despite the tensions or the dilemmas doing this form of scholarship, trying to direct it both at academic audiences and reach people outside of academia, and also perhaps how you see your role as public anthropologist in conjunction to your other roles. Like Nikki, you are very actively, you define yourself, identify as an activist anthropologist. So I'm very interested to hear whether public anthropology is an extension or a follow-up of activism or advocacy, or the accompaniment that each of you were doing in the field, working with people on the ground.
Sure, I could get us started and then pass the baton around the circle. So, you know, when I was writing this, I was thinking about my freshmen as a public, and I've taught many different ethnographies over the years, and I find it harder and harder to find accessible ethnographies and rich ethnographic stories and tales. There was an era in anthropology where if it was the 70s or 80s, I feel like we could have grabbed a whole bunch, but now it's very steeped in what I sometimes describe as inaccessible theory to undergraduates, right? And so I was really thinking, because when I teach intro to anthropology, I often think about it as like a toolkit, or like there are lots of tools in the toolkit. And many of the struggles our students have is like how to engage in kind of productive conversations with family members that might have a very different kind of politics. Like, what can anthropology bring? And so I thought a lot about them when I was writing this, because I wanted it to be political economic in its perspective. I wanted them to have a sophisticated understanding of how city politics works today, or even neoliberal governance, but I wanted to do it in a way that they didn't get trapped and embedded in the theory and then kind of retreat, which is what I see happening often. I wanted the stories to kind of take them on a journey towards learning more and digging even deeper into questions of politics. And I wanted, I think, to inspire them to also think about social change, right? Like, if our classrooms become extensions of sort of the work we do, in my case, it's organizing and activism. And right now, what a better time, right? They're all thinking about a compromised future and climate catastrophe, and like how ecological crisis intersects with economic crises. And I think, you know, mapping out sort of how to do this kind of work in a very sensitive way was sort of what my objective was. I would say this second book was me, wholly me. The first book was really much more about a dissertation being turned into a book, and I didn't feel I had the kind of liberty to find my voice, passion, even like descriptive language, right, that I really wanted to play around with in this book. So I was able to combine my own history, my commitments to teaching and funneling students into social change, but then also thinking about how a book can be transformative, right? Is there a way that it can grab them inspire them and think about very local struggles, right, as a place to possibly put some of their energies. So that's what I was kind of thinking about when I was writing. And for me, you know, the question of the public, like, how do we make our ideas accessible, right? If we were writing this to someone who, you know, doesn't live in urban Baltimore, what is the context they'd need to grab onto these stories? So that's some of what.
Yeah, so I guess to me, what was very interesting was that, you know, after I drafted and received some of the reviewers' comments, I remember, I think it was you, Ieva, who encouraged me to talk more about myself. And I was thinking like, oh, this is public anthropology, but why are you asking me to talk more about myself? And then, you know, your prompt like really helped me to explore why I came to this thing and why I came to write about this stuff. And then, you know, I came from a non-academic background, non-anthropology background. And, you know, to me, I was like, oh, you know, this is my first, you know, book, not only the first academic book, but first book I'm writing in a different language than I can speak to. So, you know, I cannot write in the ways that the native speakers can write. So that really made me think about the limit of my own ability to be able to write beautifully, which kind of like made me sort of scale down my goal. So at that point I said like, you know, what kind of book, you know, can I write? And I was like, oh, I want to write a kind of book that, you know, when people read it, they want to visit the area. So, you know, that kind of sort of setting the goal really helped me to write the way I did. And I think that's part of the reason the different parts of the book, I kind of like speak to the reader because I kind of want them to, you know, not only learn about the area, but sometimes question me. And I said, like, are you really telling me the truth? And I was like, my position is like, well, if you doubt it, please go visit and see yourself. You know what I mean? So that like really made me sort of imagine the public not as separate from myself, but I'm also part of it, you know, as an interlocutor who will be kind of like continuing the conversation. And my book is just the beginning of the conversation. So, you know, I guess I would say that the soul searching, you know, asking about myself, my positionality really led me to reimagine what the public is and the public anthropology. And I think that's the result, I guess, I produced.
I think it's a really great question. I know for me, over the kind of the course of my career doing this work in Guatemala, when I first went to do my first summer of field work was 1994 in Guatemala. And I remember feeling like I was participating too much, that somehow I was gonna, you know, get in trouble for over participating with the forensic team. And I ended up learning forensic anthropology because they needed help. And they assumed because I came from Stanford that I would know how to do archaeological excavation in a grade, which of course I didn't because I was studying cultural anthropology at Stanford. But so they taught me. So I literally learned how to do the excavations, and I learned all the bones in the human body in Spanish. I don't know them in English. Like I learned it in the field, right? And Clyde Snow used to say, you know, these guys are the best teachers. They see more skeletons in a week than most people in the US see in their career, which is true because there were so many people killed in these massacres. And then I remember an advisor saying to me, well, you can't really talk about forensic anthropology. This was a biological anthropologist. You can't talk about forensic anthropology because you're using it as a tool. So you can't really teach it. You're using it as a tool, right? Because it was like, oh, you've stepped over that line. I think that's changed a lot over the last almost 30 years, right? Because it is not, yeah, it's almost 30 years. And that's not, it wouldn't be considered too participatory. Like, I think that the lines are a lot more open than they were. It's not so constricted, but I've always considered myself a public anthropologist and a human rights advocate. And I think that's the base of my work. And I think, if I think about the through my books, most of my books are actually in Spanish. They're not in English. I have more books published in Guatemala than in the US. And some of those books in Guatemala were published in Spanish before any of it was published in English. Some of them are sections of books that were published in English that are in Spanish. And there's one about the massacre of Ponceos. It's a book that's only been published in Guatemala, but sometime I will translate to English because I don't have it in English and publish here. Because I think it's really important for me to publish this work and make it accessible to the communities where I've worked. And I have to say that in my world as a public anthropologist, I think one of my most favorite moments was presenting my book, The Massacre, La Masacre de Ponceos, The Massacre of Ponceos, in Ponceos. They invited me to go there, and I hadn't been in Guatemala for a couple of years because of death threats. And so we made a kind of a family decision that we would go back, and I invited all these different friends, and they came from different countries, and we had four-wheel drive vehicles, and we drove up to the place, and there was a good US ambassador at the time. He told everyone that he was going to be there. So the people in Ponceos were like, it's really odd today. It's like the bad people all disappeared because they thought that the US government was coming to the Ponceos, I guess. Which I don't know that would make a difference today, but then it did. And in any case, the great thing about it was the teachers in Ponceos who invited me to go and present this book about the history of the Ponceos massacre. But really, it was because the people in Ponceos were organizing against a military base being put in Ponceos. And so they were really using me to have this public event. And they told me right before the event, a couple days before, just to be honest, they told me what they were doing is if that would be okay. I'm like, sure, that's fine. Because what they did was they brought a petition with 660 some odd thumbprint signatures of local villagers who did not want a military base in their town that had suffered a massacre. And I just kind of love that because it's the opposite of the way that anthropology is often represented, right? It's like, I'm not using anybody, it's like, is Rigoberta Menchú being used when her testimony is used? No, Rigoberta Menchú is using other people too, because we're all humans seeking some change, seeking some kind of a better world. And I just thought it was kind of beautiful that I was there reading my book and was brought into this process. So not only were they part of my story, I became part of their story, and they used my story to make their story better. So I just thought, I have to say, and there were 600, 700 people in this auditorium. It was 150 degrees. It was super, super hot. And it was just beautiful. It was an amazing moment. And so for me, that's my public anthropology moment. I would have thought before it would be testifying in international courts, which is really amazing and cool and a great contribution, but being able to be back in communities where I've worked and be welcomed there and wanted there to help them further their own agenda is hugely gratifying.
So the books came out pretty recently. Nikki, yours came out at the end of 2022, so maybe was out a little bit longer than Victoria's and Rio's. But what have been the reactions so far in South Baltimore, as well as in academia in Guatemala, as well as in academia in Japan, as well as in academia? What have you heard from either people who contributed to making those books or people in the broader audiences?
So this is something I was very nervous about, just because I think, especially when you're writing about your hometown and your closest interlocutors and friends and dear comrades, how the book was going to be received. But actually, having a physical copy of our struggles has allowed me to put activists into spaces they normally wouldn't be invited into. And so with every talk, with every university that's interested in, teaching, I will bring one or two activists to be part of the conversation. So folks have said we've like disrupted the way talks are usually given in academic spaces. And I think that that's a great thing, right? Like the more we can think outside the box about how we sort of communicate ideas, how knowledge is produced, even, talks. Why do we have to have a formula for kind of theory woven into ethnography? Isn't there a way to give a linear sort of talk about the work that we're doing? So I feel like in some ways it's opened up new spaces, right, for thinking alongside some of these young people, and it's given us opportunities to travel all over. And then now we're getting traction across the country of folks who want to come and visit South Baltimore as part of an environmental justice class. So we do toxic tours, and it's just kind of amplified, I think, the work that we're doing. And it's been an opportunity to say, can we have conversations across borders now, right? Like, is Pittsburgh's air quality when we give a talk at Pitt as bad as Baltimore's? And like, what tools can we grab from each other's toolkit and begin to organize across spaces? So it's opened up really interesting opportunity.
That's a difficult question. I don't know who else is buying books other than myself to just circulate. But one of the things that I've learned recently is that the Japanese audience is very interested in the sense that, I've been trying to talk to a Japanese press to possibly translating the work. And then their comments being like, well, we are interested in your life story, but we're not sure about your book. So they just kind of discovered, because there was a newspaper feature of my sort of life trajectory from the social outcast in Japan and came to US, and then, did this research and wrote a book. So they want me to write that book talking about my life, but they don't want to hear about this Japanese individual moved to United States and writing about stuff happened in Japan. So it's been super interesting. I just need to find a way to somehow, I guess, emphasize to me the nuclear goals, the writing aspect of it is very important part of myself. But I might first have to just write like a short book, just talking about my life, and then they might want to have it.
Yeah, you might have to like smuggle it in, smuggle the story in, come in and look what I can tell you about atomic livelihoods.
Exactly.
So, well, for me, I guess also just because I have been working in these communities for a really long time, it's funny because when you're saying that about being in Japan, even though my book was just published now, I've been talking about the murder of Claudina Isabel Velasquez Pais and her father's quest for justice for years. I remember once actually giving a talk at Kanagawa University Law School I think that's in Yokohama. I had a colleague of mine, Miho Omi, was translating from English to Japanese. And the older male law professor stopped her and said, no, you must be making a mistake, because they couldn't believe how high the murder rate was in Guatemala. They thought that she must have made a mistake with the number. And 3 times they had me repeat the number until they all agreed that she was correctly translating the number. I had to write it down on the board because it just seemed so high, because the murder rate in Guatemala at that point, I think, was over 60 per 100,000. And in Japan, it was less than 1/2 of one person per 100,000. So, context is everything in trying to understand stories sometimes. But I think I agree a lot with what Nikki was saying about building out spaces. So for me, the book talks that I'm giving are opportunities to build out the work. So I just did one in Washington, D.C. with Erica Ifan, who's a judge in exile. And in fact, one of the chapters of my book is #Tengo Miedo, #I'm afraid, because when she fled, she posted why she fled Guatemala. as a judge, that she feared for her life. And she's incredibly courageous. And on later this week, I'll be at Widener University with Ana Lopez Sales, who is a lawyer in Guatemala, but she's a Maya woman lawyer. And, you know, when I started working in Guatemala, there were no Maya women lawyers. And she's the president of one of the associations of Maya women lawyers. So kind of amazing, I think. Those are kind of arcs of positivity in this work. So it's really nice to be able to share spaces with colleagues. And for me, because I'm a senior anthropologist, I really try to work with junior colleagues and open up spaces for junior colleagues, especially internationally, organizing panels, bringing in young women and men, mostly young women, to give them a platform, but from other countries and from different experiences. So that they have a space to tell their stories and share their research and their different perspectives also.
Well, thank you all so very much for sharing your books and your thoughts on these important topics. And I don't know, I feel really inspired and want to go and teach your books right away. And I hope they have your books live a long life in the hands of readers and travel far and wide, and that you have a lot of interesting stories to tell about what people learn from them and what they do with what they learn. So thank you very much. And I hope to see you all soon.